getting land, oil rights, whatever we had. They took it away because we had a president that maybe wasn't watching, but they're not going to do that. We want it back. They took our oil rights. We had a lot of oil there. As you know, they threw our companies out, and we want it back.
You just heard him say it, and suddenly the air becomes thinner. The world collapses into a crystalline moment of clarity, where the mask falls away, and you see American empire stripped down to its rawest impulses, and already your blood begins to hum with a frequency that speaks of rage and history, compressed into 5 brutal words that sound almost quaint in their audacity, because they took our oil is what he just said. Donald Trump literally just framed Venezuelan sovereign resources as American property that was somehow stolen from us, as though the entire nation of Venezuela were some kind of wayward Exxon subsidiary that forgot who really owns the deed to the ground beneath their feet. And before we even unpack the staggering colonial entitlement embedded in that phrasing, we need to understand what just happened literally today. Because Stephen Miller, a top aide to United States President Donald Trump, has suggested that Venezuela's oil belongs to Washington, describing the nationalization of the South American country's petroleum industry as theft. And this isn't some archival footage from the Banana Republic era. This is December 17, 2025. This is happening right now as warships circle, and Trump has ramped up his maximum pressure campaign against Venezuela since returning to office for a second term in January, with Trump announcing a blockade on Venezuelan oil tankers, describing them as sanctioned, while the U.S. military seized an oil tanker off the coast of Venezuela, in what Caracas correctly identified as international piracy. But what truly should arrest your attention and send shivers of historical recognition down your spine is the breathtaking ideological work being performed here, because when Miller declares that American sweat, ingenuity, and toil created the oil industry in Venezuela, he's not making an economic argument, but rather articulating the purest distillation of imperialist logic, whereby capital investment somehow transmutes into permanent territorial sovereignty and the labor of American Venezuelan workers. Decades ago grants the United States eternal dominion over resources that belong under international law to the Venezuelan people themselves. This rhetorical maneuver deserves our sustained analysis because it represents nothing less than the resurrection of doctrines we thought had been buried beneath the weight of decolonization movements and international human rights frameworks, yet here they emerge phoenix-like from the ashes of 20th-century anti-imperial struggle to assert that the fuel belongs to the Latin American country under the international law principle of permanent sovereignty over natural resources. But Trump and his cadre of nationalist revanchists simply do not care about such niceties, because America will not allow criminals, terrorists, or other countries to rob, threaten, or harm our country, nor will it allow a hostile regime to own our oil, land, or any other assets that must be immediately returned to the United States. And notice the possessive pronoun there, our oil, as though petroleum deposits formed over millions of years beneath Venezuelan territory somehow bear American passports, and you begin to understand that we're witnessing not merely aggressive foreign policy, but the return of something far more atavistic and dangerous, the reassertion of what scholars of imperialism have long identified as resource colonialism, dressed up in the language of law and order and counter-terrorism, but fundamentally rooted in the belief that American corporations have proprietary rights over the natural wealth of sovereign nations because they once held concessions granted by compliant dictatorships decades ago. Let's excavate the historical foundations because Venezuela nationalized its oil sector in 1976 and brought it under the control of the state-owned PDVSA, and later, in 2007, the late left-wing President Hugo Chavez nationalized the remaining foreign oil projects in Venezuela, effectively ousting U.S. oil giants like ConocoPhillips and ExxonMobil. And these are facts, historical events that occurred within recognized frameworks of international law, where, under the presidency of Carlos Andrés Pérez, Venezuela officially nationalized its oil industry on January 1, 1976. With this move, the country assumed control of the chief supplier of foreign oil to the U.S., as well as the largest and most sophisticated petroleum complex in Latin America. Following patterns established across the post-colonial world, from Iran's nationalization of Anglo-Persian oil to Mexico's expropriation of foreign petroleum companies in 1938, because this was the entire project of decolonization, the reclamation of sovereignty over natural resources that had been extracted under conditions of profound inequality and often outright coercion during the era of European and American imperial dominance. When Trump demands these resources back, he's engaging in a discursive sleight of hand that erases the fundamental illegitimacy of the original arrangements whereby American oil companies secured extraordinarily favorable contracts from authoritarian Venezuelan governments that ruled prior to the democratic opening and populist mobilizations of the mid-20th century, and what Miller frames as theft was in fact the democratic assertion of popular sovereignty, the Venezuelan people through their elected representatives declaring that the wealth buried beneath their soil should benefit Venezuelan citizens rather than enriching shareholders in Houston and New York. And this distinction matters profoundly because Washington's aims were nakedly expressed by National Security Advisor John Bolton, who told Fox News on Monday that with a successful coup, it will make a big difference to the United States economically if we could have American oil companies really invest in and produce the oil capabilities in Venezuela, and that would require the reversal of Venezuela's nationalization of its oil industry, which took place more than 4 decades ago, long before the advent of Maduro, or his predecessor Hugo Chavez, and the transformation of the country into a semi-colony of U.S. imperialism and big oil. And there it is, the admission that strips away all pretense about democracy promotion or humanitarian intervention to reveal the raw economic calculus. We must understand this within the broader architecture of American hemispheric domination, because that formal project dates back to at least the 1823 Monroe Doctrine, when the U.S. unilaterally claimed Latin America as its exclusive sphere of influence, and the Western Hemisphere is America's neighborhood, and we will protect it. As Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth recently declared, and notice how property metaphors structure imperial discourse, where an entire hemisphere becomes a neighborhood, implying American proprietorship and the right to police who comes and goes and what they do with their own resources. And by the mid-1970s, Latin America had been transformed into a hemisphere dominated by U.S.-backed right-wing authoritarian regimes, precisely because independent powers in this hemisphere, going their own way, were the threat that Washington and Wall Street could never tolerate. And this is the crux of the matter, the thing that Trump's statements reveal with unusual clarity, that American foreign policy toward Latin America has never fundamentally been about democracy or human rights or even really about specific ideological formations, but rather about maintaining a particular economic order, where Latin American nations function as resource extraction zones and captive markets for American capital. The oil question concentrates these dynamics with special intensity because petroleum has been the lifeblood of 20th and 21st century capitalism, and Venezuela sits atop the world's largest proven oil reserves at an estimated 304 billion barrels, 18% of global reserves, making it a prize of almost incomprehensible value. And when Hugo Chavez was elected president and implemented policies aimed at increasing state revenue from the oil industry to support his social programs, which included changes in the management of Petróleos de Venezuela, SAPDVSA, and while these initiatives initially reduced poverty and improved literacy rates, they also led to economic challenges due to over-reliance on oil exports, coupled with reduced private investment and economic mismanagement. The response from Washington was immediate and escalated because the Bolivarian project, whatever its flaws and contradictions, represented an intolerable assertion of resource nationalism and the redirection of petroleum rents away from transnational capital toward domestic social programs and debt relief and regional integration projects like ALBA that threatened to create alternative poles of economic organization outside American hegemonic control. Now we're watching this drama reach a potentially catastrophic climax because President Donald Trump said Tuesday he is ordering a blockade of all sanctioned oil tankers into Venezuela, ramping up pressure on the country's authoritarian leader Nicolás Maduro in a move that seemed designed to put a tighter chokehold on the South American country's economy. And Trump's escalation comes after U.S. forces last week seized an oil tanker off Venezuela's coast, an unusual move that followed a buildup of military forces in the region. And let's be absolutely clear about what a naval blockade represents under international law. It is an act of war, a belligerent measure that attempts to seal off an entire nation's coastline, and the fact that Trump announced this, not through diplomatic channels or congressional authorization, but via social media post, tells you everything about the lawless improvisational imperialism we're witnessing where while the campaign has killed at least 95 people in 25 known strikes on vessels, in what the administration claims is counter-narcotics operations, but which looks increasingly like collective punishment designed to strangle Venezuela's economy. Here's where the contradictions become almost too absurd to credit, because while Trump frames this as recovering stolen American property, the actual mechanics of contemporary oil imperialism are far more complex, since it's about creating the conditions to overthrow Maduro and denationalize the Venezuelan oil industry, which would reverse not just Chavez-era nationalizations, but the entire framework established in 1976, returning Venezuela to a condition of dependency, where the first 75% of revenue from Guyanese oil goes to ExxonMobil and Chevron, purportedly to cover the costs of finding and developing the wells, while the remaining 25% would be split among a consortium of oil companies, ExxonMobil, Chevron, and Hess, and the government of Guyana, resulting in Guyana receiving only about 14.5% of the revenue compared to the initial 79% of revenue for their oil resources going to the Venezuelan government after nationalization, and this is the model Trump seeks to impose, a return to colonial extraction ratios, where the overwhelming majority of value flows outward to metropolitan centers, while the country sitting atop the resources receives a pittance, and Trump has the audacity to call this recovering what belongs to America. The ideological work required to transform Venezuelan sovereign resources into American property depends on several interlocking mythologies, and the first is the notion that American corporate investment creates value ex nihilo, that somehow the capital and technical expertise brought by Exxon and Shell in the early 20th century represented such a profound contribution that it established permanent claims superseding national sovereignty, and this conveniently ignores that prior to nationalization in the 1970s, various Western companies dominated Venezuela's oil wealth, beginning with Royal Dutch Shell, an Anglo-Dutch venture in the early part of the 20th century, and ending with the antecedents of modern-day ExxonMobil, Standard Oil, Exxon and Mobil, prior to nationalization, under concession agreements negotiated with dictatorial governments that ruled Venezuela for much of the early 20th century, denying their own citizens democratic participation while granting sweetheart deals to foreign corporations, and the fact that American companies made massive profits over decades of operation extracting Venezuelan oil at favorable terms somehow transmutes in Trump's telling into a situation where Venezuela owes the United States. The second mythology involves the demonization of nationalization itself as inherently illegitimate theft rather than the exercise of sovereignty recognized under international law, and we need to recall that, under the presidency of Carlos Andrés Pérez, whose economic plan, La Gran Venezuela, called for the nationalization of the oil industry, Venezuela officially nationalized its oil industry on 1 January 1976 at the site of Zumaque Oil Well 1, Mene Grande, and this was the birth of Petróleos de Venezuela S.A. following a global wave of resource nationalizations driven by post-colonial states asserting control over their economic destinies, and while a World Bank arbitration tribunal ordered Venezuela to pay ExxonMobil 1.6 billion, this represented compensation for assets not perpetual ownership rights, and the subsequent Venezuelan government expropriated the assets of foreign oil companies that declined to restructure their holdings to grant PDVSA majority control. Notably, ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips resisted these terms, leading to the seizure of their assets, which again followed recognized legal procedures, even if the adequacy of compensation remained disputed. But Trump's rhetoric completely bypasses these frameworks to assert something far more fundamental and dangerous, that American corporate presence anywhere in the world establishes claims that supersede sovereignty. The third mythology construct Venezuela under Chavez and Maduro as uniquely corrupt and criminal, thereby justifying extraordinary measures, and while Venezuela's governance challenges are real, and Maduro's authoritarian consolidation deserves critique from the left, Trump's framing that Nicolás Maduro and his criminal associates in Venezuela are flooding the United States with drugs that are poisoning the American people serves to criminalize an entire nation and government, providing cover for what would otherwise be recognized as naked resource imperialism, and political observers believe the aim is to drive Maduro out of power, not least because Venezuela is not a main source of drugs, and the Trump administration has provided no evidence that any of the boats were carrying them, revealing the counter-narcotics justification as pretextual, a convenient hook upon which to hang policies actually motivated by economic and geopolitical calculation. Now let's think about what this means for the international order and the prospects for genuine sovereignty in the global South, because if Trump succeeds in operationalizing this doctrine that American corporate investment creates permanent property rights superseding national sovereignty, the implications extend far beyond Venezuela, to every nation sitting atop resources that American capital desires, and we're already seeing this logic applied elsewhere with Trump's threats toward Greenland and the Panama Canal, this notion that American interests, whether commercial or strategic, create rights that override other nations' self-determination, and what we're witnessing is nothing less than an attempted rollback of the entire post-colonial settlement, the framework established through great struggle in the mid-20th century, where nations gained independence, not merely in political form, but in economic substance through sovereignty over natural resources and the ability to chart their own development paths. The Venezuelan case concentrates these questions because oil remains central to global capitalism and geopolitics, and because Venezuela under Chavez attempted the most comprehensive challenge to American hegemony in the hemisphere since the Cuban Revolution, using petroleum revenues to fund not just domestic programs, but regional integration initiatives and South-South cooperation that threatened to create alternative political and economic formations outside American control. And this is why Hugo Chavez, Maduro's far more popular predecessor, became president and pursued policies of popular sovereignty and resource nationalism aimed at ensuring the nation's vast oil reserves, the largest in the world, served Venezuelans rather than being siphoned off to enrich foreign corporations, and from then on, Venezuela became the latest target of Washington's efforts to undermine, discipline, and ultimately neutralize troublesome progressive governments across Latin America, because the threat wasn't simply that Venezuela controlled its own resources, but that it might provide a model for other nations to follow, creating a domino effect that could undermine American economic dominance across the hemisphere. The sanctions regime that Trump inherited and expanded represents economic warfare on a scale designed to produce social collapse, and we need to be precise about this because while economists and news reports state that the crisis began and shortages and high inflation existed in Venezuela before the sanctions and that sanctions prior to 2019 targeted Maduro and Chavismo elites while having little impact on average Venezuelans, with the Washington Post stating in April 2019 that the deprivation long predates recently imposed U.S. sanctions, and the Wall Street Journal saying economists placed the blame for Venezuela's economy shrinking by half on policies of the Maduro administration. The post-2019 sanctions targeting the oil sector represented a qualitative escalation because Venezuela, which has the world's largest proven oil reserves and produces about 1 million barrels a day, has long relied on oil revenue as a lifeblood of its economy. And since the Trump administration began imposing oil sanctions on Venezuela in 2017, Maduro's government has relied on a shadowy fleet of unflagged tankers to smuggle crude into global supply chains, and now Trump proposes to eliminate even these survival mechanisms through naval interdiction. This brings us to perhaps the most chilling dimension of Trump's statements, because when he demands that Venezuela return land, oil rights, whatever we had, he's not just talking about oil company assets, but articulating a vision of American dominion that extends to territory itself, and we need to read this alongside his threats to take back the Panama Canal and acquire Greenland to see a pattern of territorial revanchism that should alarm anyone concerned with international stability, because these aren't merely rhetorical flourishes, but statements of intent backed by massive military deployments, and the U.S. currently has 11 warships in the Caribbean, the most in decades, creating what Trump described as the largest armada ever assembled in the history of South America. And when White House Chief of Staff Susie Wiles reportedly said Trump wants to keep on blowing boats up until Maduro cries uncle, we're hearing the casual brutality of imperial violence dressed up as tough guy swagger but representing actual policy with deadly consequences. The profound irony that should not escape us is that Trump's entire political brand depends on accusations that others are stealing from America, that somehow the United States, victim of globalization and unfair trade practices and freeloading allies, has been systematically robbed and requires a strong man to recover what rightfully belongs to the American people. Yet when we examine what Trump actually demands, it becomes clear that the theft runs entirely in the opposite direction, because Venezuela asserting sovereignty over resources within its own territory is somehow framed as stealing, while Trump's demand that a sovereign nation hand over its natural wealth to foreign corporations is presented as recovering stolen property, and this inversion is so complete and so audacious that it requires real ideological work to maintain, and yet the American political class, from Republicans to many Democrats, accepts the basic framework that American interests justify extraordinary measures against Venezuela, even when they quibble about specific tactics. The historical echoes should be deafening, because that formal project dates back to at least the 1823 Monroe Doctrine, when the U.S. unilaterally claimed Latin America as its exclusive sphere of influence, and its revival today is unmistakable and distinctly dangerous, with the results of that doctrine having long been clear: immense profits for the few, and violence, political upheaval, social dislocation, and economic devastation for the many, and the record of American intervention in Latin America constitutes one of the most shameful chapters of imperial history, from the overthrow of democratically elected governments in Guatemala and Chile, to support for brutal dictatorships across the Southern Cone, to the Contra War in Nicaragua, and military interventions in Haiti and the Dominican Republic, and now we're meant to believe that Trump's threats against Venezuela represent something different, some righteous recovery of stolen goods rather than another iteration of the same imperial playbook. We need to connect this to broader patterns of contemporary imperialism because Trump's statements don't emerge from vacuum, but reflect deeper structural dynamics where American capitalism, facing stagnation and declining hegemonic power, seeks to reassert control through increasingly coercive means, and the bipartisan nature of this project should alarm us because while Trump's rhetoric is uniquely crude, the policies continue trajectory established under Obama and Trump's first term, where the administration of President Joe Biden authorized the license in 2022 after Maduro agreed to work with Venezuela's political opposition toward a democratic election, but the election, which took place in July 2024, was neither fair nor free, and Maduro was sworn in last month for a third six-year term, despite credible evidence that his opponent got more votes, and Biden's government for months then resisted calls from Venezuela's opposition and others to rescind the license before Trump moved to escalate, demonstrating continuity in strategic objectives even when tactical approaches differ. The question of oil cannot be separated from the climate crisis because Venezuela's reserves represent approximately 18% of global petroleum, and any rational approach to preventing catastrophic climate change requires that the vast majority of these reserves remain in the ground permanently, yet Trump's vision involves not carbon transition, but rather regime change to facilitate denationalization that would bring American oil companies back to maximize extraction. If regime change is coming to Venezuela, the largest proven oil reserve on Earth will play a central role in the country's future, meaning that this imperial venture threatens not just Venezuelan sovereignty, but the prospects for any coordinated response to planetary emergency, and the bitter irony is that Venezuela under Chavez attempted to use oil revenues to fund transitions toward alternative development models, including social programs and regional cooperation, while Trump seeks to return those revenues to corporations whose entire business model depends on perpetuating fossil fuel dependence. Let's think carefully about the legal and moral principles at stake, because Trump's position effectively argues that international law and sovereignty are meaningful only insofar as they serve American interests and can be discarded when they don't. And this is not hyperbole, but rather the plain meaning of demanding that Venezuela hand over sovereign resources because American companies once held concessions, and on his social media he assumes that Venezuela's oil, land, and mineral wealth are his property, a Venezuelan government statement said of Trump's post. Consequently, he demands that Venezuela immediately hand over all its riches, and the President of the United States intends to impose, in an utterly irrational manner, a supposed naval blockade on Venezuela with the aim of stealing the wealth that belongs to our nation. And while we should approach Venezuelan government statements with appropriate skepticism, this characterization is essentially accurate because Trump is demanding exactly what they describe. The stakes extend far beyond Venezuela, because every nation in the global south is watching this confrontation and drawing conclusions about what sovereignty means in practice, and whether the post-colonial settlement holds any residual force against resurgent American imperialism, and if Trump succeeds in his Venezuelan adventure, whether through invasion or regime change or economic strangulation, it will send an unmistakable message that resource nationalism will not be tolerated, that nations attempting to assert control over their own natural wealth will face overwhelming coercion until they submit, and this has implications for lithium in Bolivia and copper in Chile, and rare earth minerals across Africa and anywhere that nations might seek to leverage resource endowments for autonomous development outside the circuits of American and Western capital accumulation. We must also reckon with the racialized dimensions of this imperial discourse, because Trump's framing of Venezuelans as criminals and terrorists flooding America with drugs and criminals taps into deep veins of anti-Latin American racism that has structured American political culture for more than a century, and the ease with which he can mobilize these tropes to justify aggression against a nation of predominantly brown and black people should remind us that imperialism and white supremacy have always been mutually constitutive projects where the supposed civilizational superiority of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants justified conquering and exploiting darker peoples and extracting their resources for the betterment of the superior race, and while this ideology rarely appears today in such explicit form, the underlying logic persists when Miller can declare that American ingenuity created Venezuela's oil industry, as though Venezuelans were incapable of developing their own resources without white Western intervention. Here's what should terrify everyone paying attention because the military buildup and sanctions escalation and naval blockade and seizures of vessels are all creating momentum toward actual military conflict, and Trump has for weeks said that the U.S. will move its campaign beyond the water and start strikes on land. And what would this mean in practice? Would it be precision strikes against specific targets, or would it involve broader military operations? And what happens when Venezuela, which has been arming and preparing for exactly this scenario for years, responds with force? And what role does Russia, which has military cooperation agreements with Venezuela, play? And suddenly we're looking at scenarios that could spiral into conflicts with implications far beyond the Caribbean, and all of this to enforce Trump's claim that oil beneath Venezuelan soil belongs to American corporations. The opposition to this imperial escalation must be unequivocal, and it must come from multiple directions simultaneously, because the anti-war movement, such as it still exists, needs to mobilize against military intervention, while the climate justice movement needs to connect Venezuelan sovereignty to the broader
struggle against fossil fuel extraction, while anti-imperialist forces across Latin America and the global South need to demonstrate solidarity with Venezuela, not necessarily because Maduro's government is admirable in every respect, but because the principle of sovereignty and self-determination, non-negotiable, and if Venezuela falls to American aggression, no country in the region is safe. The labor movement in the United States needs to recognize that American oil workers have far more in common with Venezuelan oil workers than with Exxon executives, and that real working-class interests are not served by imperial wars fought to enrich corporations, and progressives in Congress need to use every tool available to block military authorization and cut off funding for these operations, and the progressive media ecosystem needs to relentlessly expose the lies and propaganda being used to manufacture consent for aggression.
This is a moment that will define whether the international community has any capacity to resist unilateral American aggression, or whether we're entering a new era of naked imperial conquest, where might makes right and sovereignty is honored only when convenient, and the next few months will be absolutely critical, because Trump's threats are not empty bluster, but statements of intent, backed by massive military deployments, and if we fail to build sufficient opposition to halt this escalation, we may find ourselves watching in horror as American bombs fall on Venezuelan cities, ostensibly to recover oil that never belonged to America in the first place, and future historians will look back at this moment and ask why we didn't do more to prevent catastrophe when the warnings were so clear and the imperial logic so transparent, and we need to be able to answer that we fought with everything we had, because anything less would be moral abdication in the face of injustice, so profound that it threatens the very foundations of international order and human solidarity across borders.